Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Bad Night to Go Out, submitted by Zio. I've lived most of my life in a fairly shady neighborhood. I've mentioned that before here a few times, and it's true. Street fights weren't uncommon in my youth, and being a pretty short guy, I got a lot of shit on the regular. I learned quickly growing up the importance of self-defense, and later even got some formal training. However, there are sometimes situations where it just doesn't matter, and this was one of those. I lived in an old house that had a full basement that once functioned by a previous tenant as a separate apartment of sorts. It had its own entrance and exit door, a bathroom, kitchen-like area, 2 huge closets, and a full-size bedroom. As such, it was a great place to have friends over in my teens, especially late at night, because I could just go downstairs and open up the basement door to let people in. This was one of those nights. I had 2 friends over, and it was about 1 a.m. John and Chris, and both of these guys a good bit bigger than me. In fact, John's about 6'2", and Chris is about 6 foot even and pretty well built. The point is, while I'm a smaller guy, these 2 weren't. Also important to note that this was a good few years before it was normal for everyone, let alone teenagers, to be carrying a cell phone everywhere. This was the time of landlines. None of us were hard asses. I had at this point some moderate self-defense training under my belt, but honestly, we were nerds. We got together that night to play Magic: The Gathering. Anyway, though not too long after they'd arrived, we got the idea to go wandering around and into the backwoods a few blocks over. Just bored teenagers seeking adventure. We got outside and had walked no more than 10 minutes before we saw a small group of guys slink out from the side of one of the nearby houses. We really only noticed because we noticed the burning cherry of 2 cigarettes. There were 3 guys we noticed as they got a little closer, and instinct told me to start prepping for confrontation. One of the guys simply asked, "What's up tonight, fellas?" But there wasn't friendliness in his voice. I jabbed Chris in the ribs and gave him a look, kind of trying to wordlessly ask if he was ready. At this point, we knew this was bad, and John stated, "Look, we don't want no trouble." I guess that was all it took. The guy on their side in the middle lunged in a few feet between them and threw a sloppy hook at John. It caught him in the eye, though, and he stumbled back. The other 2 dashed out, and one got Chris straight in the nose. He buckled under the blow, and the guy started to pound on him while he was down. The last guy, of course, was in it for me, and only last because I'd been the furthest back as we'd been walking. He came in fast and reeked of alcohol, and we started to fight. I dodged a haymaker and took one straight to the ribs, and then one more wild one to the underside of the chin. It stung, but not because he'd really hit me hard, but rather I bit my tongue on impact and I could taste the blood. It dawned on me that this guy was wasted and honestly wouldn't be that huge of a threat. But the guy on Chris was pummeling him. I needed to get to him. And I couldn't even see John from where I was. The guy and I tussled for a few, and I got about 2 or 3 shots in on his abdomen, and all of a sudden he cried out in surprise and took a dive to the left. John had tackled him. Rather than trying to be a hero and possibly failing, I did the first thing that came to mind. I picked up a fairly large chunk of asphalt and threw it like a baseball at the guy on top of Chris. I aimed for his head, and it connected with his ear. He shot up rigidly, clamping his ear in one hand, and stumbled over Chris as he was trying to get to his feet. I yelled something. I don't even honestly remember what, but Chris was back on his feet and swaying a little. His nose was bleeding badly. I pointed up the street, towards the woods we'd originally planned to go exploring, and Chris and I began to take off. I kinda half-assed grabbed John on the way, as he was still fighting the other guy, and we bolted. The other guy chased after us, and we jumped a low chain-link fence and then bounced into the woods. At least 2 of them had followed a few feet behind us, because we could hear them cussing us out. They kept saying they'd catch up and calling one of us Jeff. We dashed as fast as we could through the woods, which really wasn't that fast, as the ground was uneven, with leaves and tree roots everywhere, and the branches of trees kept whipping at our faces. Chris was moving slower and slower, too. He kept saying his nose was broken, and it came out nasally, like someone suffering from a cold. We ended up circling to the right, somewhere along the way, and just kind of hunkering down behind a pretty thick line of trees and foliage. Chris's nose was pouring blood, and it was certainly broken. We heard rushed footfalls out past our line of trees, maybe 30 feet away, and we heard the guys talking. One was coughing badly. They were still referring to one of us as Jeff, and kept talking about a piece in the glove compartment. This had gone from a shitty, scary situation to a potentially terrifying one. They thought one of us was someone else, and who knows who, and we were talking about what we could only assume was a gun. None of us were armed with anything, and Chris was not doing well. His breathing was ragged, and he was struggling to stifle coughs from all the blood running down the back of his throat. I was trying to scour the ground for a good-sized stone or stick, because I was sure they were going to find us, and I didn't think we'd get away so easily this time. We were lost in the woods as is. Their voices got further away, though, so we felt it might give us the opening to try and get out if we could find the way. So we broke for it, hurrying out from around the tree line and trying to make as little noise as possible. After a while, we heard nothing but our own labored breathing and the general sounds of the woods at night. We slowed down a bit to catch our breath and hopefully find the clearing leading back to the street. After wandering for a bit, we did indeed find the street again and took back to full flight mode, or at least as fast as we could go with Chris in tow. He kept having to spit bloody loogies out as he was running. We got back to his grandmother's house where he stayed, and we helped him inside. Now, he wasn't allowed to hang out with John due to some dumb shit we'd done in the past and gotten the police called on us. He'd ended up being taken home in a police cruiser, and that was that, no more John. For some reason, his grandmother loved me, though. So I took him inside, and he made up a story on the spot that I'd come over to play cards with him, and he'd fallen down the back stairs and smashed his nose on the hand railing. She didn't really seem to buy it, but he insisted, and I excused myself and went out back to meet with John around the corner at a church parking lot we'd often meet up at. We had to go back to my place, and it was still a bit of a walk, and we'd have to pass at least somewhere close to the street where this had all started. We decided John would just stay at my place in the basement until morning, so he didn't have to walk home from there, which was all the way across town. We took off, and while we were paranoid of every approaching car or every strange noise, it was pretty uneventful for the most part. We'd passed that dreaded street and felt pretty confident that we were in the clear when we heard a slow approaching car from behind a few streets over. We started to run across the road to try and jump the fence leading into a random house's backyard, and amazingly enough heard, "There he is! Get that piece of shit!" We jumped the fence as John exclaimed, "You gotta be fucking kidding me!" We bolted as fast as our legs would allow us through that backyard, jumped another fence, and continued that trend through several more yards and over several more fences. We came to a tall privacy fence that we couldn't easily get over, and turned and just dashed through the house's front yard and kept running until we couldn't. We'd stopped fairly close to my house and ducked down into a big sewer or aqueduct-type structure. We caught our breath and just jogged back to my backyard and down into the basement and locked the door. That was that. Luckily enough, we'd lost them or they'd given up and hadn't followed us to my house. Needless to say, neither of us slept much that night. We found out the next day that, of course, as we'd pretty much guessed, Chris had indeed suffered a pretty badly broken nose. He had black eyes for almost 2 weeks after that. John had a busted blood vessel in his eye and a sore jaw, and I had a sore rib cage for a few days. But all things considered, it could have been a lot worse. We were pretty hesitant to go out at night for a good while after those events, and it was honestly one of the crazier, though probably not the craziest, nights of my life. Angry People in the Woods, submitted by Single Track Sean. So this happened back in 2010 in northern Pennsylvania. Anyone from that area knows that there's choice mountain biking, and back then I had more time to ride than I do now, so at least twice a week and once per weekend I was out there making every minute count. One place that I would frequent was state land that butted up against private plots and farms and such. The farmers were super cool to everyone that used the trails as long as they didn't trespass, and I've had more than one long conversation with them, making me forget why I was out there in the first place. However, out there, not everyone is so nice. My friend Taylor and I found that out one summer. This story takes place over 2 summer months of that year. Taylor was one of my best riding mates, and we teamed up a lot on relay races and such. One late afternoon, we were navigating some gnarly single-track stuff that looped between a steep climb and a fairly long downhill section. Fairly long equals about a mile. There were tons of rocks and roots and down trees for obstacles, so it's really technical, and you have to pay attention there. As we're rocking our way through things, we came across a guy and his girlfriend on the side of the trail, and she was obviously hurt. We stopped and asked if they needed anything and if they were okay, and she was, but she still was kind of in rough shape. The guy told us that someone rigged up something on the trail that caused his girlfriend to have an accident, and the first thing we thought was, well, this is pretty technical. Maybe this section is beyond her capabilities. Later, Taylor and I noticed the racing tag on her helmet that was for experts, so that ruled that out. The guy pointed to a log in the path meant to be a rideable obstacle, but on one side, someone had dug out about 2 feet down across the trail and put a thin layer of sticks and covered it with dirt and moss. Anyone bunny hopping the log would have sailed clear, but someone else just wheeling over it would have gone ass over handlebars, as their front wheel would have surely smashed through that crap and right into the hole. That's exactly what had happened to this woman. All 4 of us talked about who would do something this insane, and got to filling in the hole. The woman's front wheel was bent a little, but not tacoed, so the 2 slowly rode off, and we told them the goings were safe as we'd just come that way. Later, over a beer, Taylor and I talked about that incident. He looked at me and said, "Dude, you know that wasn't another biker that did that, right?" I agreed and thought about what kind of asshole would go out of their way to do something like that. I stopped thinking about it until my next ride out there when I went solo. I was more cautious than usual, and it kind of ruined the ride. After a bit, I got over my tenseness and got to one of my favorite downhill sections where I loved putting my butt over the back wheel and just really going for it. But for the already stated reason, I did hold back a little. Something still didn't feel right. About halfway down, I stopped completely, and my intuition was right on. You couldn't really see it in the dark of the woods. It was light out, but you know how it gets darker in the forest. But there was something there. Right at about what was chin or neck level on me was a piece of braided fishing line tied taut between 2 trees. It was right after a really sharp turn, and anyone with speed in my size would never have had time to stop. I looked around and shook my head. Another frickin' trap. I took out my multi-tool and cut that shit down and went on my way, even more wary. For the next 2 weeks, I didn't go back there. One night, I was on a local MTB forum and saw someone had started a topic about what was going on out there. Me and Taylor weren't the only ones who had encountered stuff. There were at least 5 other people who had found similar traps all around the trails, but mostly in one section. I started to notice that most of them were on parts that ran alongside private land. I thought about it and realized that I never really saw any farmers or anyone else for that matter out there. As I mentioned, other sections of the trail had people that would chat us up. But in that section, I never saw a soul. Everyone agreed to let everyone else on the forum know what they had found and where, and to take pictures if they could. We were going to take everything to the police and park rangers. After a few days, nothing was noticed. But then, suddenly, things started to get worse. More traps were noticed that were meant to take people down. but now some of them had tons of broken glass and shit in the dirt and grass. Some logs had been set up against deadfalls, so if someone were to ride over them, the movement would cause the dead trees to fall onto the path. Now it was getting serious. One day, Taylor and I were out there, and he had ridden ahead a little bit. And that's when I saw them. Two guys I'd never seen before were down a short hill, and they came out onto the trail. They had shovels and bags of who knows what, and after they looked around, they started digging a hole next to a puddle. Most mountain bikers know to ride through puddles, but noobs will often ride around the sides of a puddle because they don't want to get wet or don't want to gauge how deep the puddle is. This was a trap obviously set for them. They didn't see me as I had stopped to the side of some trees at the top of the hill when I had noticed them. I watched them for a little bit, and then I heard Taylor yell out, "Yo, Sean, you riding or you hiding?" He must have turned around looking for me. The two guys heard him too, and they looked up and after a minute grabbed their shit and ran back into the woods. I rode down the hill to where they were and saw the little hole they were working on. Taylor rode up and asked what the hell I was doing, and I told him, and we both scanned the woods, seeing nothing. Then we heard a shotgun blast not too far away, and we immediately got out of there. We reported everything to the police, but my description was pretty lame. I vowed I was not going back there, but Taylor said maybe they'd lay off if they thought we'd seen them. And I thought it was over. 2 days later, a guy I raced with once in a while got hurt really bad after a fall on a downhill section after someone shot him with fireworks. I don't know what it was, but I heard he said it was like a bunch of shit exploded right in his face and it shot him off the trail, and he cracked into a tree. Fucked his back up and his new stump jumper. Now the police were starting to look into things. After they patrolled out there with some guys on quads, things died down again and there were no more traps. Taylor convinced me it was cool to go again, and I did. And this time we went with a third friend, Mindy. She was and still is a beast on 2 wheels, although she's a roadie now. Anyway, we were out having a great time and decided to stop for a break. We were in the questionable section, but none of us were uneasy. We were just chatting and getting ready for the push back out. Then, Mindy stopped talking mid-sentence and stared over our shoulders. On the trail were 2 men wearing what looked like demon Halloween masks. They were literally maybe 20 feet away, and one was holding up a dead rabbit in one hand and a knife in the other. As we stood there looking at him in disbelief, the guy began stabbing the rabbit and then pointed the knife at us. I heard a noise behind us, and I turned to see 2 more guys with masks on, and one was holding a shotgun. None of us said a word until I whispered, "What the fuck are we gonna do now?" Mindy finally yelled out, "Look, we don't want any trouble. Let us ride out of here and we won't come back, okay?" I was thinking, yeah, they're really gonna go for that. A maniac who was stabbing an animal and pointing a knife at us with his 3 fucked up friends, and they're just gonna let us leave, right? What seemed like 5 minutes passed with these guys just staring at us. And Mindy yelled out again, "Okay, we're leaving." Then, as quietly as they showed up, all 4 of them went back into the woods without saying a word. "Well, what do you think?" I said quietly. "Let's just go," said Taylor, and he got on his bike. We all started pedaling away, all eyes on the part of the trail where they had just stood. It was Mindy, Taylor, then me. Right after we passed the exact spot where they were, something came flying out of the trees, and it was the guts of the rabbit, and they splattered on Mindy and Taylor. How they missed me, I don't know. We jammed it into overdrive and really rocked the shit out of there. Had we been in a race, we'd all have placed first, second, and third. We got back to our vehicles and called the cops, and they came out and took one look at the gore on Mindy and Taylor, and then called for people to head out into the woods on ATVs again. They never found anything, and as far as I know, that was the last anyone saw of those guys, and there were no more traps either. I stayed away from that place for a couple of years, but I have been back. It's still great riding and it's safe, but every time I get to that place where we stopped and saw those guys, I half expect to see them again in those demon masks. Let me tell you, I don't stop. I always haul ass right through. Chased, submitted by Giddy Kitty. A long time ago, when most people hearing this were probably not even born, I was driving from Chicago to visit my friend at Southern Illinois University. It was a straight shot for the most part, but my friend I was visiting, I'll call her Christy, asked me to stop at her grandmother's house off the beaten path in the middle of nowhere, a place called Iola. She wanted some papers from her family that were going to be part of some project she was working on at school. Hey, no big deal to me. I'd get off Route 57 and fly over there and then get back on the interstate. I left early in the afternoon so I could get to Carbondale in time for dinner and then be able to go out dancing. Following my written down instructions, no cell phones or GPS, kids, we just had maps and such, I got to an exit that would take me to Iola and Christy's grandparents' house. I found that easy too, and her sweet grandmother made me stay and chat for a bit and have something to eat. I really wanted to get back on the road, but how do you say no to a little old lady who lives way out in the country? Like so many stories on this channel, here my troubles began. Her grandfather, a well-intentioned soul, gave me different directions to head south and get on Route 57 at a different exit. Apparently there was construction on the way I was going, and this back route would be faster. Being a 20-year-old idiot, I agreed, thinking of the prospects of my friend and hot guys at the college. The sun was going down as I started driving down country roads, and I was just playing my tapes on the car stereo, hoping this would get me to Christie's faster. Not long after I left, I saw I needed gas, so I stopped in another little nowhere town called Xenia. Basically, there was a gas station there and not much else. I filled up on gas and tried the payphone to call Christy to let her know where I was and I was going to be probably late, but it was out of order. I noticed out of the corner of my eye a guy in a pickup truck talking to another guy in a car. They were really giving me the once-over. Armed with some chips and Pepsi, I got back on my little horizon and looked at the directions again. I was to stay south until I got to another interstate, get on that, and then head west at 57. No problem. I jogged through Xenia town proper, and this place looked like a freaky movie out of the 70s with this strip of building storefronts and nothing else. And soon, I was back out in the boonies. It was dark when the lights went on behind me, and I saw what looked like a cop, but now I realized it wasn't cop lights at all. But I wasn't too sure, so I pulled over, and the guy in the car got out and came over to my window. It was the guy from the gas station, and he had this blue shirt on with some emblems, but it didn't look like a real uniform. But again, I'm out in the middle of nowhere and don't know what I'm dealing with. He asked for my license and all that stuff, and asked me if I knew why I was being pulled over. Not really knowing, I said as much, and he walked back to his car. I was pissed that I was being waylaid and knowing that I hadn't done anything wrong. He came back and asked me to step out of the car, and being young and dumb and not knowing I didn't have to do this, I got out. The guy said something about me having a nice body and handed my stuff back, but as I reached for it, he pulled it away playfully, at least that was playfully in his head, and he asked if I was interested in going on a date that night. I was taken aback, but I was also smart enough to know not to cause trouble. I said I was flattered, but I had plans and really needed to get going. He just stared at me for a long time and gave me my license and just turned and walked away. I got back in my car and pulled away thinking the whole thing was really weird. I kept going, but couldn't help notice that the car behind me started following me again. Then again, it was a straight shot with just a couple of turns, probably going the same way I was. But it became evident something was up when a pickup truck came roaring up and passed both of us and then swerved in front of me. I flipped the driver off for scaring me and yelled a little bit, but I let it go. I was more worried about the guy behind me. Then all of a sudden, the truck started slowing down, and the guy behind me flipped on his brights. It was then that I knew something was very wrong. The high beams went off, and the truck got a little faster, but after a few minutes, the car behind me started flicking the beams on and off, and I was really starting to lose it at this point. I'm out in the middle of fucking nowhere, and these two guys are messing with me, and I'm a tough woman, but I was really scared at that point. I saw a sign that 15 was coming up, and I remember that I think 15 can take me to another town before the interstate Christy's grandfather told me to take. We came to an intersection where the right-hand turn is supposed to happen, and the truck just stopped in front of me and didn't move. The car behind me got up so close I couldn't even see his lights. We all just sat there. I burst into tears and screamed out, "What do you want?" before the truck turned in the opposite direction I was going. I gingerly moved up and made the right and floored it. The car behind me didn't follow, and I was still in tears and sobbing as I drove along quickly. But less than a mile later, I saw lights behind me coming up fast, and the same thing happened again. Again, I was boxed in, now screaming with tears rolling down my face. I didn't know what to do, but I saw signs that a town called Mount Vernon was coming up, and that was the biggest town before I could get back on 5764. More cars started popping up, and we got into town, and I started to feel a little bit better, but was still scared they might try something, and no one in this town would care. I saw a Hardee's coming up and thought I'd go in there and ask for help. And one good thing happened, and one bad thing happened. I got stuck in a drive-through lane, not realizing that's where I was. But the truck didn't realize what I was doing, so he kept going on straight. The car behind me got cut off by a guy also going into the drive-through, so he was still following, but now 2 cars behind. I got to the little order box and screamed that I needed the police, and someone had to help me. The poor girl working the drive-thru said she'd get a manager, and eventually I got to the window, and they said they had called the police and to pull into the parking lot to sort things out. A manager guy came rushing out and stood by my car, but the other car drove off and screeched into the street and drove away. The police came and I told them everything, and they took a report, but there wasn't anything else they could do other than keep an eye out for the truck and car based on my description. When I told them about the police officer I didn't think was a cop, they took it seriously, but again, there was still little they could do. One of them asked me if I wanted to stay in town for the night, but I said I really needed to just get out of there. So they followed me to the interstate and got on with me for about 15 miles, making sure that I wasn't being followed. One pulled up alongside me and gave me a "you okay" look, and I nodded and gave a thumbs up. They both got off at an exit, and I sped the rest of the way to Carbondale. I have no idea what those guys were trying to do other than scare me, but they really got to my core. Once I got to Christie's, I melted down all over again, still so scared. Nothing else happened, and I did enjoy my weekend there and hooked up with what I thought was a hunk at the time. Hey, girls need love too. And Christy spent a ton of time apologizing for sending me out to her grandparents. So, all ended well, but even today, this many years later, every time I see someone flick on their high beams behind me, I freak out a little bit. I don't think that trip will ever leave my mind. Craigslist kidnapping, submitted by Anonymous. I don't want my name on this, so please read it, but I'm not naming the towns this happened in or any of the names involved. This is a cautionary tale. I'm a female, 32 years old. I'm 5'5" and only 115 pounds, and I think that's relevant to this story. I was selling my son's old Wii on Craigslist because he didn't want it anymore, and he was saving for a new Xbox. So, up online it went, and I started getting all the lowball offers and such. But one matched my price, so I made my move. Mind you, this was done all via text, and I was going to make arrangements for the person to meet me at a Tim Hortons in my town. I was under the impression that I had been speaking to a guy, but it ended up being a woman in a blue Ford Focus. She said she apologized that her husband couldn't be there at the last minute, so she was taking his place. I thought, no big deal. We made the transaction, both said thanks, and I went through the drive-thru to get an iced coffee. All went well, I thought, and on the drive home I stopped to price out Xboxes at a local store. I saw what I needed and went home and thought that the games were out of my life for a couple of days. But I was wrong. The next night, our friends up the street from us were having a party, and my hubby and I went over for some drinks and to hang out. My husband had to get up early the next day and wanted to leave before me, so I said I'd text him when I was leaving, even though it was less than a 3-minute walk away. I had another glass of wine and it got to be around 11:30, so I decided to call it a night. I texted my hubby, talked to my friends for a few more minutes, and then started the short trip home. I saw an odd-looking van, and how typical on our street, that I had never seen before. Oh well, I thought, probably someone at someone else's house. We have a fairly busy neighborhood. As I was nearing the van, I saw a woman walking towards me under a streetlight, and she looked familiar. As we got closer to one another, I was startled by the noise of the sliding door of the van on the street opening, and as I looked over, the woman walking towards me flew at me and actually tackled me into the van. It happened so fast that I could barely understand what was going on. The door shut and the van took off as another woman in the van flipped me on my stomach and had my hands handcuffed really fast, and it dawned on me what was happening. I started to scream, and a voice yelled, "Shut that bitch up," and someone started wrapping tape over my mouth. A pair of hands was holding my feet, and they taped them together too before letting me go. I looked up screaming, and for the first time saw that one of the women in the van was the woman from Craigslist. The other two women, I have no idea who they were. Now I'm beyond terrified, and I'm kicking out and doing whatever I can to fight, and Craigslist woman grabs my legs, tells me to shut up, and the other woman puts tape over my eyes. Like I said, I'm a pretty small woman, and these two women were much bigger than me. The van kept driving, and I had no idea where we were going, if I was ever going to see my son again, and honestly, I thought I was going to be killed. The driver was making all of these turns, and a voice next to me asked what the hell was going on. The driver said, "I think someone's onto us." They all started freaking out, and the van sped up and slowed down over and over again, and I'm still screaming and shaking every part of my body I can, and suddenly the van came to a stop. The driver just yelled out to run, and they all left the van with me tied up inside, and I heard shouting and a vehicle peel away. The next thing I know, I hear my friend, whose party I was just at, yelling into a phone, and I guess it was to the police. I was screaming my head off, but she kept yelling over to me that the police were telling her to stay away from me unless I was bleeding or hurt. The whole thing was a cluster you-know-what, and it took another 5 minutes for them to show up. I don't think I need to stress what kind of shape I was in, and I'm not ashamed to say I peed myself, I was so scared. The police got there, got me out, and I remember how painful it was having them get the tape off of my head and mouth and hair, and then thinking how stupid of me to care about that. An ambulance came, and I said I just wanted to go home, and by this time I was bawling my head off and shaking. I won't bore you with all the questions and statements, but this is the gist of what happened. The women who kidnapped me didn't realize my friend had come out of her house because after I texted my husband I was coming home, I had left my phone on her kitchen counter. She saw what had happened when they grabbed me, got into her car, and started to follow even though she was pretty drunk. The police decided to overlook that due to the circumstances, and her brother is a state trooper to boot. She had called the police on her phone and chased the van behind a shopping mall, and saw all three get out of the van and jump into another truck and take off. She couldn't get the license plate. The van I was in was stolen, and it turns out the Craigslist woman's phone she had originally contacted me on was what one officer called a burner from Walmart. I guess it was a pay-as-you-go phone long since disconnected. We figured that after we met at Tim Hortons, she must have followed me home and then was stalking me for the right time to grab me. So I got out of it okay. They never found the people who did this, and I've been living in fear ever since. I'm in counseling and therapy, and my hubby is too because it's not easy living with me sometimes. I admit it. I'm super protective of my family and have forbidden social media for my son until he's 16. That might sound harsh, but these people know where I lived, and we don't live there anymore, and I don't want them ever finding me again. This happened 5 years ago, and it's still in my mind like it was last week. The scariest thing that I haven't mentioned, and that no one told me until not too long ago, and the reason I'm writing this to you to get it off my chest, was that the pickup truck that my kidnappers drove off in was missing its tailgate, and when they shot off, a wooden box slid out onto the ground. It was basically a coffin with 2 big hinges, padlocks, and had holes drilled into it on one end. I have no idea what they wanted with me, but I am sure that it doesn't take a genius to know that that box was made for me. I don't like to think about what may have been. To everyone out there, be careful online. I know what happened to me is not typical, but it's proof that it can happen. Thanks, Uncle Josh. Home Intruder by I Love Pussifer. This happened about 6 years ago, but first, a little backstory. Back then, I was in university and lived about 10 hours away with my parents. It was a long drive and our hometown was super boring, so I only visited for Christmas. That year, though, because I was going through a bad breakup, I went home for the summer, wanting to just be lazy and sunbathe in my parents' garden with some trashy novels. Luck was it that my cousin who lived next door, was 2 years younger than me and close to me like a sister, was also home visiting her mom. My parents had a big dog, a Cane Corso if you know the breed. It looked scary, but was a gentle giant and a surrogate mother to our kittens. Anyway, I was home for a couple of months, and my parents were going on holiday for 2 weeks on the other side of the country. I was okay being home alone, although it was a bit weird, because at this point I had been living in a big city for a few years, and was not used to everything being so quiet at night. All I could hear was crickets, and sometimes wild animals from the nearby mountains. It made it hard to sleep, so I decided to move into my parents' bedroom because they had a TV there and I could keep it on all night for some noise. One night, my cousin came to spend the night because her mom was working the night shift and she didn't want to be home alone. So we decided to watch some horror movies and eat pizza in bed. At some point, I fell asleep, but my cousin, let's call her Anna, couldn't sleep. She was quite jumpy and easily scared, so the movies got her freaked out. I was deep asleep when she woke me up, super freaked out, and saying that someone was in the house. My mind was foggy. There was some beer with that pizza. I could barely keep my eyes open, and I told her she was being paranoid and she should go back to sleep. But she insisted there was someone in the house, and she was shaking and crying, so I was starting to worry about her. I sat up, and I heard a noise downstairs as if someone closed the cutlery drawer in the kitchen. I flinched and put the TV on mute, and I got up and slowly locked the bedroom door and tiptoed back to bed and listened carefully. I heard the wooden floors creaking as if someone was walking around, and at this point, I was starting to join Anna in the freakout. My parents have a sensor light in the hallway. It's placed kind of in the middle of the stairs, so it will go on if someone is walking around both downstairs or upstairs. I heard the click of the light going on, and I could see the light under the bedroom door, and now I'm 100% sure someone was in the house. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the town is in the middle of fucking nowhere, and I have no service. My cousin was bawling, and I had to put a pillow over her mouth to muffle the noise, and she was holding onto the pillow and biting it to stop herself from screaming. Whoever was in the house was now climbing the stairs, and my mind was going 100 miles an hour, and I was trying to think of all possible scenarios. My best guess was that some neighbor noticed my parents' car had been gone for a few days, And they know our dog is harmless, and they know my folks are doing quite well for themselves. So maybe they're trying to find some jewelry or something. I figured if we kept quiet, they would take whatever they wanted and then go. So I told my cousin to quietly get under the bed, and I looked out the window and saw no one was on the street. Since my parents' bedroom is next to mine and mine has a balcony, I figured if push came to shove, we could climb out the window, reach the balcony, and since it's overlooking the vegetable garden, we could jump and hope the soil wouldn't break too many of our bones. As I moved to crawl under the bed, the doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to get in. I froze, and I swore time stopped. My heart was beating like crazy, and I looked around, and the only weapon I could see was my mom's crochet needle in a basket by the bed. I figured I'd stab the sucker in the eye or something, and the doorknob rattled for a few more seconds, and then the intruder walked away. I heard whoever it was shuffling through the rest of the rooms on the floor, but I figured he or she's too quick to actually take anything. The worst thoughts crept into my head. My dad's a detective, and he worked some horrible cases involving sex trafficking rings and stuff, so what if someone was here for him? It wouldn't be the first time our family was threatened. But if that was the case, I might be dead by morning, and the thought shot adrenaline through my body. When I couldn't hear anything for a few minutes, I decided I had to get out of the room, find some cell service, and call the police. My cousin begged me to stay, but all I could think about was as if someone was after revenge. They could burn the house down with us in it or something. Also, stupid as it may sound right now, I was really worried about my dog, too. She was out there all alone, and if someone was to approach her, she probably would just lick their fingers before they shot her or something. Anyway, I took my phone, my crochet needle, and left the room. I stepped into my parents' dressing room and took my dad's baseball bat, and then made my way downstairs. The front door was wide open, and as I walked outside, I could see a man running away. I immediately called the police, and to my surprise, they told me a call was already made for that address. They were on their way. I assumed my cousin somehow called when I was gone, so I didn't question it, and the police arrived in less than a minute. It wasn't my cousin who called, and it took us a while to understand what was going on, and the officer was as confused as we were. In the end, what happened was, my neighbors were not aware I was home for the summer. They knew my parents were gone, and when they saw the lights on in the house, they started to worry. I didn't lock the door that night, and my dog had the habit of opening it with its paws and napping on the sofa downstairs. She probably opened the door at some point in the evening and then decided to go back out, and the door was left wide open. She does that a lot, and I should have known to lock the door, but I forgot. My neighbor thought someone was robbing us, so he came in, went into the kitchen to take a knife from the drawer, and then walked around to see if anyone else was in the house. He called the police at some point, and when I got out of the bedroom, he heard me, got spooked, and then ran away. So, worried neighbor who was stupid enough to go into a house while he thought it was being robbed in the middle of the night? Let's not ever meet again. I Think It Wanted Me. Submitted by King Dave. When I was 14, my dad and older brother were in prison, and me and my mom were homeless and staying with friends in a little camp trailer in their backyard. It was summertime, and we live in Northern California, and for those that don't know it, it gets really hot in the summer around here. The people we stayed with had 7 kids, and they ranged from 6 months to 14 years old, the oldest being one of my best friends since we were little. The house they lived in wasn't that old. It was in pretty good shape, but there was something else that lived there. It was a shadow of a young boy. If I had to guess, I'd say maybe about 5, and it had been seen by more than one person. The first time I personally saw it, the dad of the house stepped into the doorway of his room where me and his wife were sitting on the bed playing Dr. Mario. She said to him, "I thought you put the kids to bed." And he said, "I did." She replied, "Well, then who is that?" I looked over at him, and there was a small shadow next to him in the doorway, and it quickly ran away. We chased it into the kitchen, and it just disappeared. I mean, it was creepy. The story goes deeper than that. One night, it was really hot, too hot to sleep out in the trailer, as there was no electricity out there. So me and my mom decided to sleep in the house. Everyone inside was already sleeping, but they always left the door unlocked for us to come in. I'll explain the layout of the house real fast. When you went into the living room, it opened up into the kitchen and dining room on the other end. There were 2 couches that laid in an L shape, and the one I was laying on, I could see through the kitchen into the dining room where there were some bunk beds that the smaller kids slept on. When I came into the house, the oldest of the small kids, I'll call him TJ, was asleep on the couch, so I scooped him up and laid him down on the bottom bunk, and then went back to the couch. My mom had laid down on the other couch with her head closest to my head, and I closed my eyes and tried to go to sleep. I lay there for about 15 minutes and got an overwhelming urge to open my eyes, and when I did, I was instantly filled with fear. There was the shadow boy, and he was standing over me in a way that seemed like he was going to kiss me or something. He had one knee on the couch next to me, and his arm over the top of me on the back of the couch, and the other arm on the arm of the couch, and was bent over me with his face about 6 inches from mine. It was fairly dark in the room, but there was enough light coming through the windows that I could see around the house, and even being that close, it had no features. It was just shadow. I knew it was something bad. I could just feel it, and it scared the shit out of me in a way that a normal living kid wouldn't be able to scare me. I just said, "TJ, go back to bed." And this thing stood up and began walking into the kitchen towards the bunk beds. But something didn't seem right about it. I just knew it wasn't one of the kids. So I sat up while it was about halfway through the kitchen, and I yelled out, "TJ!" And at that point, this thing stopped as TJ sat up on his bunk bed and said, "What?" Then the thing disappeared. I laid back down, not knowing what to think about what had just happened. But my mom spoke up, and she said, "What the hell was that?" She had seen it too. I said, "I don't know." And without another word, we both got up and went to our trailer. We lived there for about another year, and I never slept in that house again. But my story doesn't end there. Fast forward to about 10 years, and I'm now 24, and the house was abandoned. Part of it burned down, but was still standing, and there were no door or windows. I was at a friend's house and needed to go to another friend's house on the same street about 2 blocks away, and that meant I'd have to walk past the house or walk around 3 blocks to go around it. It was around 11:30 at night, so I said, "Fuck it, I'm not going to go 3 blocks out of my way," and just started walking. I got to the house and glanced up as I was walking by and noticed how bad of shape the place was, and a couple of steps later, I looked up again and saw the shadow boy standing in the broken-out bay window looking at me. I almost pissed myself, so I picked up the pace. I looked up again, and it was standing on the porch now, and I didn't know what to do, so I acted like I didn't see it as I walked. I looked up once more, and it jumped off the porch and started running at me, so I took off like a shot. The street was down a slope, and thank God, as I was running, I started doing that thing where you're running too fast for your legs to keep up, so it was almost like falling. I never looked back until I got to the end of the block under a streetlight, and I stopped and looked back and saw nothing. I turned and continued on my way to my buddy's house, and when I got there, my man asked me, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah. Why?" He said, "You look like you've seen a ghost." I smiled and told him, "Yeah, I saw a cop, and he scared me." I don't know what the hell that thing wanted from me, or why it was so interested in me, but I never walked by that place anymore. If I drive past it, I don't look over at it. Since then, the place has been fixed up, and people do live there, and I wonder if they have any experiences like the shadow boy like me. but I'll be damned if I ever go up to that house to ask. Motel Ghost by Jamie. After moving to California in the late 60s, my mother and then her now late husband, Dan, decided to purchase a small motel by the beach. This motel housed approximately 20 to 40 units, as well as a small built-in house for the owners, my mom and Dan. At the time, Mom and Dan had 4 children, 2 boys, Carl and Andy, ages 15 and 2 respectively, and 2 girls, Beverly and Ann, 13 and 11. All of them lived in the house, which had plenty of space for them. The strangeness began around 6 months after moving in. Guests would sometimes complain of bad wiring, causing things like TVs and lights to come on, or of the footsteps in the room above. The wiring was quite good, as Dan was an electrician, and he would check over the wiring after the complaints. As for the noises upstairs, more often than not they were just guests. But on occasion, they would check the registry to find that no one had been in that room, especially on the night in question. For about the next 2 years, this continued along with a few other strange things, but they were dismissible. Lost items would reappear. Doors that were supposedly locked were found open, and there were cold spots in the summer, all of which is usually explained away as the wind or a bad memory. This was Carlsbad, California, though, and in the summer it can be in the hundreds. One room, I believe it was room 22, had a habit of attracting bad people for some reason. I don't know if this had anything to do with the ghosts, but it was a room that you could count on things to be broken in by checkout time. The strange things were beginning to happen more and more often by the time Andy was 4 years old. The set occurrences seemed to happen more often, and then the real strangeness began. One morning, while Mom was fixing breakfast, Andy came wandering in sleepy-eyed and out of his room carrying something. With the usual, "Mornin', honey," Mom greeted him and proceeded to ask him what he was carrying. Presenting a small tin soldier to my mom, Andy said, "The little man gave it to me, Mama." The soldier was the type that children would have played with about 100 years ago, heavy and solid. It showed signs of aging, according to my mother. She would know. She went on to own an antique shop after the motel was sold. After questioning the sleepy 4-year-old, my mother was able to find out how he had gotten the toy. He said that a little man who sat on his closet shelf gave him the toy, saying that it was a gift. This part of the story usually makes me snicker more than anything else, because my brother still claims to remember the incident clearly, and says that the man looked like a leprechaun. Well, our family is part Irish. Anyway, he claimed the man was wearing a suit and looked like a normal man, only small and kind of sparkly. There can be no doubt that the soldier existed, as it was in our family for about 8 years, and no one knows what happened to it since. As for the little man, was he real? And if so, what was he? If not, where did this antique toy come from? And that's not the end. Out in the garage of the house, Dan had a small workshop complete with a workbench and various power tools. On the top of the workbench there was an old radio, the old type from the 50s with about 5 knobs on it and a polished aluminum face. This one was just like that, but the knobs on this one had an odd way of just flying off. There was one time when Dan and Andy were both in the workshop, and they claimed to have seen the knobs hover in the air for about 30 seconds before shooting off across the room. In the workshop, oftentimes things like wrenches and saws would disappear, only to show up again a few weeks later. This place seemed to get a bit more activity than the rest of anywhere else. And one winter day, I believe it was in January, Dan was working in the shop, making a few odds and ends out of wood for around the house. He heard a voice which almost shouted, "I'm going to get you where it hurts." That left him shaken, as there was no one around to have said that, and it was not a voice he recognized. He decided to make his way into the house. Putting his tools away and walking outside, he found something that left him terrified. The grass, which had just been watered within a half hour previously, was now on fire. It was just a small patch of grass, about 2 feet square, but it had caught on fire in the perfect shape of a heart. As strange as that sounds, my entire family swears that they saw the charred grass later, and that it was shaped exactly like a heart. Dan put the fire out and then went inside, nervous as hell. A few weeks after this happened, Dan died. He had a heart attack while at home. That was the end of the strange happenings, and things seemed to settle down a bit after his death. What happened, we might never know, but I do have one last thing to add to this story. My mother decided to find a psychic who might help her find out what had happened, and this was a few years after all of this had come to pass. What the psychic told her was that there was an old sea captain who had been buried under what was now the front steps of the motel. This had happened approximately 100 years ago, and that he was the spirit who was haunting the place. After this, my mother did research, checking public records and the like, and confirmed that a sea captain by the name given to her by the psychic did live in Carlsbad around the time, and that he had died when the psychic said he did. My mother never got the nerve up to dig up the front steps, but she believes that story. Personally, I think the psychic might have been a fake and just familiar with public records, but it's still an interesting story. Roadside Assistance, submitted by Can of Beans. Around 11 p.m. on a foggy night in 1994, in a still small central Texas town, I was driving my girlfriend home from our date on a well-traveled highway near her home. We were in high school, and not wanting to infuriate her father, we dutifully planned to be early for her curfew. About 1.5 miles from her home, as we crossed the hill and drove into the river valley that crisscrosses the county, we approached the overpass at the river. Our eyes were drawn toward the red lights across the bridge, which were certainly not anything we had seen before. Due to the dense fog, we could not decipher the source of these lights. I slowed the truck a bit and changed lanes to put space between us and the lights. I'll admit, my chest tightened as we drew closer to the unexplained lights. UFO? Fatal accident? Something sinister? None of these things we were caring to stumble upon on a creepy, foggy night, but for some reason, I expected it. I proceeded with extreme caution, and I did admit I was anxious. Our eyes were finally able to pierce the dense fog, and we realized we were looking at the taillights of a disabled truck in a bar ditch. Not like you may expect when someone careens from the road surface and is stuck in a ditch. No. This truck was perpendicular to the highway, and the headlights were in the bottom of the shallow ditch and still on, with the taillights solidly positioned 90 degrees in the air. Not one tire was touching the ground. Slowly, aloud, I said, "What the hell?" This wasn't a TV drama-style cliffhanger where the truck was teetering on the brink. Dude was frickin' stuck. We stopped beside the disabled truck to better gauge the situation, when my girlfriend noticed someone sitting on the culvert drain pipe near the truck. The stranded driver appeared to be a bit older than us, but it was difficult to be certain. His knees were pulled to his chest, and his head hung low in his folded arms as he shook his head without pause. Fearing the worst of the aforementioned uncertainties, I shouted to the driver, "Hey man, you okay? Is anyone still in the vehicle?" The guy raised his eyes from his arms for a brief moment, though not looking at us, and reassumed the position, never acknowledging our presence. I felt something was definitely amiss, so I hollered, "Don't worry, bud. We'll be back with a tow strap to pull you out." I promptly stabbed the gas, and he never looked up. As expected, my girlfriend spun around to look at me with a mixture of disgust and woman rage. She remarked with an appalled tone, "Where are we going? That guy needs help. You have a tow strap in the toolbox, right?" I had a tow strap. I also had a heavy and unshakable feeling that something wasn't right, though I couldn't define it. As I sped away with my foot on the gas and her chewing my ass, I made it to the turnaround about a third of a mile up the road. I made the loop and peered in my rear view to confirm the scene had not changed. I paused behind a small grove of trees at the turnaround to tell my girlfriend, "Something's not right. I think we should call 911 for the guy and haul ass." She disagreed and suggested if I was uncomfortable, we could call her brother-in-law and he would be there in just a couple of minutes. That seemed fair enough, so I decided to make a pass on the divided highway to reassess the situation. We had been stopped for no more than 45 seconds when I turned back to drive past the stranded motorist. We cleared the small grove of trees to see the taillights were now out. "Well, where did he go?" my girlfriend asked, very puzzled. I glanced left to see the driver and truck were gone. Nowhere to be found. I was speechless. This highway is long, relatively straight, and even on a clear night, headlights in their glow can be seen for over a mile. In the fog, it's magnified skyward. In the brief time it took for us to turn around, someone who was in royally effed status in a ditch and completely distraught managed to collect his emotions and hulk a full-size Chevy Silverado back to roadworthy condition and slip away unnoticed. The nearest road is about 3/4 of a mile away, so unless he drove on oncoming lanes of traffic or through the closest barbed wire fence, repaired it, and then even through an endless hayfield, homeboy vanished into thin air. Looking for an answer of any sort, I turned to my girlfriend to see an expectedly perplexed look on her face. When our eyes met, she said sharply, "Drive." As she quickly squared up to face forward, I happily obliged and drove in the opposite direction of her home and back toward town. We drove for about 5 miles in silence until she asked with obvious concern without looking my way, "What did we just see?" I couldn't provide a solid answer. Somewhat out of the blue, the day after, and still clearly bothered by the event, she would add, "Did you notice the traffic?" After dialing in on the nature of her random question, I told her I hadn't. She said, "We saw no other cars anywhere. It's a major highway. When have you ever been on that stretch of road and not seen another vehicle for over 10 minutes? I mean, even sheriff's deputies would have driven by every 10 minutes. I hadn't considered the notion, but she was indeed correct. No matter the weather or time or day of night, passenger vehicles and large trucks travel that road with a steady rhythm. There was no way 30 seconds would pass before a vehicle was seen. The next day was bright and clear, and I drove to the location where the truck had been, and I pulled over for an investigative look around. I parked about 400 yards away and walked over, taking notice of every detail. Or I would have if there had been any. There was nothing. No skid marks, no disturbed gravel, no tire tracks in the grass or even uprooted grass where the truck had been sitting on end merely hours before. It would be impossible to maneuver a 2-ton vehicle in that manner and leave no sign. Ultimately, I resigned to file it away in my mind as just one of those things. 24 years later, I still have no explanation for what we saw that night, or the lack of evidence that anything ever transpired. I'm not frightened by this occurrence in any way, just completely baffled. I'm interested in suggestions. Thanks for listening. Shapeshifter, submitted by Old Troll. Back in the late 70s in Worcester, UK, I was living in my family home, as was my sister, Dee. My sister and I discussed the paranormal, and both were very open-minded on that subject. At least I thought I was. Until late one night when she came home from seeing her boyfriend with a rather far-fetched story to tell. This is Dee's story. Dee and Jay, her boyfriend, were parked up in a lane down the road from our house. It ran alongside a canal separated by trees and bushes, and it was dark, of course, but lit slightly from a nearby motorway bridge. Dee told me that there was a sudden jolt from under the car, quite a strong jolt, causing the car to wobble. Jay looked out of his driver's side window and told Dee to look too. a black shape slowly seemed to ooze out, like a shadow onto the tarmac road. The shape stayed low as it moved into the road. It was jet black and now appeared to have a tail lifting up. Its body began to rise up as it moved away from the car, and Dee said it looked to be about the size of a Great Dane, yet moved like a cat slinking. Dee pointed out that they both agreed later that it was in fact way too big to have been able to fit under the car in the first place. This black thing walked slowly on all fours into the middle of the road a couple of feet from them. They were too scared to put on the lights or do anything to get its attention. Suddenly, Dee said, all in one motion, it stood up on its back legs, and as it did that, it morphed into a man. A man in his middle age, with shoulder-length hair, a hat she described as maybe a trilby, and a long trench-style coat. Jay started the engine and put on the lights in a panic, and as he did, the man in the road walked calmly towards the car, waving his hands as though to signal that they shouldn't be scared. He walked right up to the windscreen as they shot off. They drove fast up the motorway roundabout, where usually there was always a police car around. They were sure they had clipped the man with the car as they sped off, and wanted to report the whole thing. Dee said that they were so shook up, it didn't occur to them how random the story sounded. Sod's Law, no police car. Dee and Jay hung around on the well-lit roundabout for a while, but there was no one around, so they had to choose a way home. Always back to home meant traveling dark lanes again, and eventually they chose one and got home. Now I listened, heard her out, and sort of pretended to believe her, just humoring her. I actually thought it was the most bubble-headed rubbish she had ever come out with. Let's jump to 2004. I was working for MenCap. It was a little residential home in Worcester. Most of the staff there were into the paranormal, and a few of us joined an interest group based on ghosts at a local pub, and we met up once a fortnight. These meetings always meant that type of conversation bantered around at work the next day, too. The day after one meeting, I was in the kitchen at work with the lady I'll call Kay, who was talking about daft ghost stories, the type no one would ever believe. I offered up the story my sister told me all those years ago, and I explained how I found it so far out that I never forgot it. As I told the story about the man, dog, Black Panther, whatever, Elle, another staff member, was coming in and out of the kitchen, getting her things together to go home, as we had all finished our shift. Elle was of course hearing bits of what I was saying, and came back in and looked at us and asked, "How did you know about that?" I explained that this was years ago and not true. And I thought maybe Elle had heard the part about it moving like a big black cat, and presumed it was about the black cat sightings we heard so much about in the UK. Maybe about a possible wild cat roaming loose. I explained this was a different story, and it was about 20 years before she was even born. Elle said, "No, it was 6 months ago. It wasn't a cat or a dog. It was a man. Whatever it was turned into a man." Whoa. I was stunned. I asked Elle all about it, and she explained that her boyfriend and friends were parked in a country road in Hereford in daylight. They were smoking joints and chilling, and the car jolted. A large creature crawled out and walked into the road, stood up, and was in fact a man in a long coat, shoulder-length hair and wearing what they called a cowboy-type hat. It moved towards the car, waving a gesture to them to let it approach, but they sped off. They agreed never to talk about it to anyone, and naturally Elle's partner confided in her. When I got home from work, I phoned my sister. I had an apology to make for not believing her, and I knew she would want to know Elle's story. My sister and I were amazed at the time lapse between each sighting, yet the man looked the same. As we chatted about this, my then young daughter came downstairs, so I mumbled to my sister that we needed to change the conversation. My daughter called out as she passed me, "It's okay, I know what you're talking about." I laughed and said, "Oh yeah? What then?" My daughter said, "You're on about that stupid story. The man at the camp we went to who was trying to scare us the night that we went on that trek." My daughter had been away with the school a few weeks previous, to a camp in Malvern. My daughter told me there was a man who was about 21, said that there was a big black animal on the hills at night that might be a bear that turned into a man. I have a very open mind to everything now. My lesson is learned. She Wouldn't Go Away, submitted by Derek. So this started when I was in high school, but spanned over the following 7 years. I was a band geek in high school. I played football and baseball too, but I was really into trumpet and jazz. Still am, have my own band too. There was this girl, I'll call her Jamie for this so as to not call her out on what happened. She was cute, but more of a band geek than me. I mean, she was really smart, but that's all she did was play her flute and study. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think we all know there's more to life than just two things. I first noticed her looking at me during band practice one day. My second trumpet and I had a duo for one tune, and my band instructor wanted us to stand up during our performance, so we did that in practice too. Each time we did the solos, I would look down and see Jamie staring up at me. Totally normal, I mean, other people watched us too. But right away, this felt weird. It got to be that she looked at me so often that I finally mentioned it to my girlfriend at the time. I'll call her Chrissy. Chrissy also played the flute, but was a few chairs down from Jamie. Chris laughed at me first, but then one day she gave me a note between classes and it said, "She is looking at you a lot in band." One day, Chris came to my baseball game and so did Jamie. No big deal, right? Wrong. Jamie sat on the bleachers staring at me the whole time I was on the field. I played first base, so she was right there watching me, and any play I made, she would scream and cheer, and finally my girlfriend went over to her and told her that I was taken and to ease up a bit. Jamie sat down and didn't say anything back, and Chris was a softball player and could be intimidating when she wanted to be, and Jamie was a year younger, so there was no outbreak at the game. The staring kept up, and I started getting notes in my locker on a regular basis. It's been a long time, but I remember a lot of them said all this stuff about how my girlfriend was cheating on me and that I should dump her. I showed Chris, and she just laughed and said it was probably Jamie trying to split us up. Our prom came, and this was the night Jamie decided to tell me that she liked me. I can't remember who she went with, but during a break in dancing and stuff, I went to get a soda, and when I turned around, there she was. She asked to talk to me, and I said, "Go ahead," and she told me that she really liked me and wanted to know me better. Before I could say anything back, Chris came up and took me by the arm and just gave her a death stare. So time moved on. I went to college, and Chris and I tried to do the long-distance thing, but we ended up breaking up. However, my sophomore year, I got a little surprise. I wasn't majoring in music, but I still did play a ton and stored some of my gear in a friend's space in the music hall. Jamie, apparently, was majoring in music, and that's when I bumped into her. She went to the same college as me. It was awkward, but I tried to be nice and chatted with her for a bit, and then went on my way. And here's where things started to go off the rails. That Friday, I was at a house party, and Jamie showed up. She was with her friends, but halfway through the night, she came over to me and hung out, which was fine. But she started trying to get me to leave with her, and it got annoying. No matter where I went at that party, Jamie would find me. And finally, I told my friends I was going to head back to our dorm. I went to the bathroom and then crawled out the window and practically ran back to campus. I went to my room and then decided to take a shower, and when I got back to my room, it was pitch black as I had turned the lights off when I went down the hall. When I opened the door, a light from the hallway came in, but it was still dark when I closed the door. I got a beer out of my roommate's mini fridge and went to my desk to turn on my light. When I did, what did I see? Jamie laying on my bed in just her bra and panties. She was smiling at me, and now don't get me wrong, I like sex and chicks like there's no tomorrow, but this chick was just weird. I asked her what she was doing and how she got in, and then remembered I probably forgot to lock the door when I went for my shower. She just smiled and said, "I'm yours. Do what you want." I threw her a sweatshirt and told her that this wasn't a good idea, and she put it aside and pulled me to her. I'm just kidding. Can I sleep here, though? Honestly, some guy followed me home from the party, and I ducked into your dorm because it was closer than mine. Yeah, knowing it was a bad idea, I still let it happen. I figured I'd let her live out her little weird dream and then she'd go away. I sat in a chair despite her saying I could share my bed with her. In the morning when I woke up, she was gone. Then the phone calls started, constantly ringing for an hour at a time, usually in the middle of the night. This was in the 90s, so we had one of those old-style desk phones in our room, and my roommate Tom was getting pissed as the phone was nearest to him. Nobody was ever on the line. The phone would ring, Tom or I would answer it, and they'd hang up. Again, it was annoying, and it had to be Jamie. I started dating a girl, let's call her Kat, and every time Kat would hang out or stay overnight, the phone would ring all night long to the point that I would just have to unplug it. One night we were having sex, and in the middle of it there was a crazy pounding on my door. It startled us, and I didn't answer it, but it kept up until I finally got up and ripped the door open. There was no one there, but I did hear a stairwell door closing down the hall. This happened a lot when Kat and I were messing around. Another night, I woke up to Jamie standing in our room at like 2:30 in the morning, standing over my bed. I yelled. Tom woke up and she ran out of the room. I rarely locked our door, but Tom made me do it after that. He didn't want anyone just showing up anymore. I started getting weird letters again, and it had to be from Jamie. Some were bad poetry, and others were pictures of what I assumed was her naked from the neck or waist down. One time, she sent me a pair of her panties and a note to suck on them to taste how much she wanted me. That was it. I went to my RA, who was super cool about everything, and said he would take care of it, and he did. Jamie was barred from coming into my dorm at any time, and our RD spoke to her RD about her too. Things went quiet. I decided to transfer to another school after that year and moved to New Mexico. My mom had moved out there, and it seemed like a smart move for me, too. I grew up in Philly, and that's where I was in school before this, and just FYI. So I graduate 2 years later, and I moved to LA to work in film, which I still do. Suddenly, I started getting weird phone calls again. Lots of hang-ups and messages that said nothing but took up my entire answering machine. Then more letters. This time threatening stuff like, "Don't ignore me, answer the phone," or "You're missing out on the best pussy you'll ever get." Stuff like that. I kept all of them, and after a month of that shit, I went to the police. The problem was, none of the letters were stamped or postmarked. The cops said they were likely hand-delivered, which I found out was a crime to use a mailbox without postage. Yeah, sorry, stupid sidebar there. The police told me to change my phone number if I could, which I did, and to also let my mailman know someone was putting stuff in my mailbox illegally. Again, done and done. The calls stopped, but the letters were now just left on my car windshield. I knew it had to be Jamie again, but how the hell did she know I lived out in LA? The final straw came one night when I was admittedly a little more than tipsy. I took a cab back to my apartment after I was at a party, and I crashed on the couch after drinking a bunch of water. I woke up in the middle of the night to hear my shower running. It took me a minute to get my bearings, and then I realized that someone was in my place. My door was open just a bit, and I started freaking out. So I looked for my cordless phone, but then realized it was in my bedroom, which was next to my bathroom. I crept down the hallway to get it, and planned on calling the cops outside my front door, but I didn't get the chance. As soon as I got the phone and turned to head back to my living room, the bathroom door opened. There was Jamie, naked and soaking wet from the shower. I had to notice she was also holding a knife from my kitchen set. She smiled at me, but I didn't stick around for anything else to happen. I ran out of my apartment and called 911. Jamie followed me, saying to hang up and that she was just there to make me happy and that she'd kill herself if I didn't stop and talk to her. Like I said, I called the cops, and as luck would have it, there was a cruiser in my neighborhood and they came right over. Long story short, I waited outside. They found Jamie in my place, wearing my clothes when they got there, and she told them that I had invited her in and that I had been in love with her since high school. She told them that she was okay to be there, to which I said no fucking way, and then told them my whole story. They took her away, and that's the last I ever saw or heard from her. All I knew was that she moved back to Philly and she lives with her mother. A mutual friend said that she finally got the help that she needed. But how she knew I moved to New Mexico and then LA is still a mystery to me, and how she found out where I lived is even stranger still. I guess now that I look back on it, I don't want to know. Something in My House, submitted by Narayan. I'm a 38-year-old male, and I've lived in Columbus, Ohio since 2005. In 2013, I was 33, and I had just stumbled on a podcast which was mostly ghost stories that were sent in from around the world, much like your own show. I became sort of intrigued by just listening to talk radio because I found it relaxing at night, and it was sort of an adventure for me, I guess. So I first started listening just out of pure entertainment, and to be honest, I never really had a reason to believe, or not believe in the paranormal, for never having experienced anything in person. I'm a fairly well-known tattoo artist and was working at a shop in Columbus during this time. I had just started working on a young man named Ryan. His mother, Kim, was there hanging out when he came in for his appointments, and she was really cool to talk to, so we'd always talk about all kinds of stuff when they came in. We somehow got to talking about my desperate search for a house to rent, and Kim happened to be a property manager for a house, which the owners had been trying to sell. At the time, my friend Nate and I were having terrible luck in our search for a house to rent and not an apartment. Kim said the owners may agree to rent it out since it was just sitting vacant, and I told her what our budget was, and she said I'll talk to the owners and see if they'll agree to that. I hadn't even seen the inside of the house yet, but we were in a desperate spot to move, and from the outside it looked good, and she mentioned all of the work that they were doing to it. And for the neighborhood and the size of the place, and what they agreed to accept for our rent, we were getting a steal. After they approved us for moving in, we were moving our stuff in the next day. We had some road bumps moving in, though. The place was vacant for a year, and they found and arrested some squatters the week we were supposed to move in. So the place was wrecked, and it looked like someone had just dumped a trash can all over the downstairs. So we waited a couple more days impatiently as they had a cleaning company come in and deep clean the entire house. This house is a 3,200 square foot Victorian home which was built in 1898. I'll give a brief description of the layout so you can sort of picture it. When you walked into a foyer with tile floors, straight ahead was a dining room. Beyond that was a kitchen, and to the right as soon as you walked in was an enormous living room which looked like it had been separated into two rooms at one point, and then opened up into one huge downstairs living area, with each side of the room having its own fireplace. I couldn't help but think about how much furniture it would take to try to fill this area. Either way, we were relieved to be in a house without having to worry about noisy neighbors above or beside us, hence the reason we didn't want an apartment. One thing I noticed right away was, if you don't know much about summers in the Midwest, Ohio especially, they are extremely humid, oftentimes even into October. Even for a muggy Midwest summer, it seemed very cool in there. Let's jump ahead to winter. The winters can be brutal here as well. We later found out that this place was beyond cold in the winter, no matter how many heaters we had going. In fact, I told Nate if we had some pet penguins, we'd have to get him sweaters. It was unbearable to walk on the kitchen floor during the winter. I absolutely had to wear socks at least to walk across that floor. And at one point, we had the furnace about as high as it would run, as well as an infrared floor heater and a kerosene heater just in the living room, and it was still pretty miserable. Anyway, upon moving in, I forgot how we chose rooms, but Nate took the huge second-floor bedroom, and for some reason I took the third-floor bedroom, which seemed a bit bigger than any of the other spaces. It was a little creepy, and for some reason upon my discovery of this podcast and my new love for listening to these true ghost stories, I was sort of liking creeping myself out at night a little bit. And to be dead honest, although the house was so big and so old, it didn't once cross my mind that this house could possibly have some energy left behind to discover. I was in for a wake-up call within about the first 2 weeks. I was laying upstairs in the evening, just relaxing, getting settled in, and I heard something coming from downstairs on one of the 3 floors, including the big and extremely horrifying basement below me. The sound which sounded to me like a mix between what would be an old squeaky water pipe and a female voice moaning. And it was very audible. In fact, I recall having goosebumps immediately. I ran downstairs and asked Nate, "What the fuck was that?" He was in the bathroom flossing, and he said, "What was what?" I said, "Tell me you didn't hear that. Come on." He said, "I didn't hear anything." Mind you, Nate is a very laid-back guy who doesn't get rattled easily. I think you could drive a frickin' sailboat into our living room and he would probably just say, "Damn, dude, I like the color of that boat. Now we just need some water." If I recall, I didn't invest too much in this old house. I think it was within a couple of days, and I wasn't thinking much about it at all. Okay, a little more about Nate. His job required him to leave town at very random times and days, and sometimes he'd be gone for 3 to 6 days at a time. I really never knew when he was going to be around or not. I had heard an episode of this paranormal show that I was into, where a guy was explaining that he had downloaded an app which made his phone act as an EVM meter. I quickly downloaded the app and got familiar with it, but most of the time I would turn the app on and just let it run. It would basically come up with words at random, and I thought it to be more of a novelty. I think I was secretly hoping that it would somehow show evidence that pointed to the contrary, and I was also sort of afraid of that at the same time. I came home on a Friday night and I sat down on the couch in this enormous living room and turned the EVM on. I got out a can of dip and sat it beside me. Almost immediately, in a creepy electronic male voice, my phone said the word couch and tobacco, one right after the other. I was immediately spooked. Within a few more minutes, I got out my pad of tracing paper and began working on a drawing for my Saturday tattoo appointment. And within 30 seconds, the app blurted out the word artist. Okay, this was getting a little too real too fast, and almost out of my frustration I yelled, "All right, if there's anyone else here, quit fucking around and make yourself known." Right then it sounded like someone in my kitchen was going through my cabinet with plates and bowls, so I went in to see if it was Nate. But there was nothing at all. Everything was completely normal. Right then, there was a sound from the living room, and it sounded like someone had lifted up my little TV and just let it fall back down. Nothing super loud, just as if my TV got shifted a little, as the type of table it was sitting on made an unmistakable sound. So upon walking back in there to check that out, and trying to get back to my drawing, I noticed nothing was out of place in there either. I sat back down, and it sounded like Nate literally fell out of bed in his room, as he was directly above the living room. I immediately texted him and said, "Hey bro, you alright? What's going on?" Within a few minutes, he texted back and said, "Yeah man, just driving back from Buffalo, New York." This is when I started looking through my contacts and inviting anyone close by to come and stay the night and keep me company. A ton of things were going through my head, like, okay, this just became really not fun, and what in the world did I get myself into with this place? It didn't completely sell me on the place being haunted necessarily, but I didn't feel like I was there by myself anymore, and the thought of listening to ghost stories with my headphones on sort of made my skin crawl. I didn't tell Nate just yet, nor did I explain this to anyone else, but I think I tried to tell a couple of friends that there was something weird going on at this new house. Very shortly after that, I had sort of regained my courage, and I was alone there again at night, and I turned the app on and began walking into my room. I asked out loud, "Is there anyone else here in this house?" Very quickly, that creepy tin can sounding voice said, "Isabel." And I looked around me 360 degrees and did a visual sweep of sorts to convince myself that if I can't see you, you aren't here. Which is dumb, I know. I felt like I wanted to talk to Kim, who managed the property. Because of her son being one of my clients, I sort of developed a friendship with her. So I gave her a ring the next day and said, "Hey, this may sound silly, but do you know the tenants who were here before us? Had anyone ever mentioned anything unusual or sort of creepy happening around here?" She instantly knew that I was serious about it, and I'm sure she could hear in the tone I had. She wasted no time to say, "Well, the lady who rented a couple years back said that there was an elderly woman who would randomly show up to the door saying, 'You're in my house. This is my house. You need to leave because it belongs to me.' Then she would leave and just periodically show back up and repeat what she had said before. This definitely got my attention. She then went on to say that she and her husband were at the house doing a walkthrough before we moved in, and her husband just at one moment said, 'You know what, I want to leave. I just feel like we're not the only ones here.' And of course that didn't sit well with me. And I explained to her all that I'd experienced so far, to which she didn't sound surprised. In fact, she seemed interested in the encounters I'd had. I'll cut to the point with the other events that occurred. I had a good childhood friend who was on his way out to Indianapolis from Delaware and wanted to stop and stay the night and recharge. I said, "Sure thing, come stay at this creepy-ass place with me." I can't remember if I'd mentioned to him the things going on, but he came and we decided to do a session of tattoo work on his arm and order pizza. We just had a good time relaxing and catching up on things. That night I was sweeping out the fireplace and had my kitchen trash can in my living room. This trash can lid had a pivot where it was able to fully flip and spin, and at some point while we were eating, there was a loud bang in the foyer that was as if you had dropped a college-sized textbook from the ceiling to the floor. Obviously, this made us both stop chewing, and we just stared at each other and said, "What the fuck was that?" Just after that sound, out of the corner of our eyes, we saw the trash can lid do about 3 full rotations, and really that was enough for him to ask me what the hell was going on in this house. I sort of said, "Well, I'm glad you're here to witness this crap, and it's made me question my sanity." I don't recall much of the rest of the night, but I do recall us sleeping in the same huge room just because we sort of were freaked out. The next day, he did ask a little bit about the house and what had happened there, but I don't recall us talking too much about it. That incident was probably the most real to me, given that we both saw the trash can lid move without anyone touching it. The next thing that I recall happening was I had a girl staying the night with me, and I'd told her a bit about what I'd witnessed. She was definitely not thrilled if I had to leave the room in the middle of the night to get a drink of water from the kitchen, which is exactly how this incident started. It was after 2 a.m., and I went downstairs to get something to eat or drink, and this time, more than any other night, I felt like someone was watching me. I just got one of those shivers like you do when you take a leak. The very second I felt that, I heard the girl scream, and I heard her on her feet running down the hall. So I darted back up the stairs and asked her what the hell was going on, to which she said that she felt the mattress kick her off of the bed, as if there was someone on the other side of the mattress kicking underneath her. Of course, I stayed right by her, and for a while she would make me go anywhere in the house with her at night. While she was there, we were constantly running to the basement to reset the breakers. There was only one certain outlet on the second floor that you could have the space heater on and not trip the fuse. This place was way more of a pain in the ass to live in than it was worth, although it was sort of a cool conversation piece anytime someone asked about where I lived. There were a few other things that had my chest thumping when they happened, and I did experience the bed shaking a couple of times when I was in it, which really fucked with me. But the last super weird thing I'll mention is, one night I was actually trying to sleep in my daughter's room, which was down the hall from Nate. No one else was there that night, but about 4 feet past the foot of the bed, I could hear what sounded like 2 men having a conversation through the other side of the closet wall. We did have a bus stop directly across the street from the house, so I walked to the window to see if there were people at the bus stop, but in fact it was after midnight and the buses weren't running. The empty street under the street lamp did add a very creepy element to this as I stared out for a minute trying to figure out who or what it was I was hearing. The talking sounded muffled and I couldn't make out a word, but it was there and very real. After I laid back down in bed, I had my ears tuned in to see if anything was going to continue, and after a moment it sure did. It became annoying quickly, and I screamed at whoever or whatever it was to shut up and leave me be. And it stopped. That year and a half I lived at that house opened my mind and obviously made me a believer in the paranormal. Although thinking back, I always thought that I was going to see an actual ghost at some point. And part of me wishes I would have. However, anytime I'm listening to your show and I hear someone talk about shadow people, I get chills just hearing stories, and I can't imagine how I'd react had I seen something. I'd probably have flipped out. Since then, I haven't seen or heard anything you'd consider creepy compared to that time in that house. But the name Isabel, which my ghost app brought up multiple times, still appears in random situations, and I sometimes wondered if I'd done some research on the history of the place, the name Isabel might have turned up. But I think I was always too afraid to find out something like that. Something Up Ahead by Bran the Viking. This event had happened to me in the late summer of 2011, early August if memory serves. At that time in my life, I was living in a small town in northwest Washington called Bo Edison, a rural community south of Bellingham, north of Burlington Sedro-Woolley, and that was off of the Chickenut Drive Highway. It's easily one of the most beautiful spots to visit. Bo Edison is essentially two small villages which overlap one another, with Bo being somewhat sparse and dotting the landscape with isolated farming homes, and Edison a bit of a hub village. They both exist in an intersecting location, geographically speaking. In a matter of minutes, you'll pass through flat farmland, hilly forests, rocky and densely wooded mountains, and oceanfront property. I had recently completed a year at trade school, attending the Job Corps program at Sedro-Woolley, and had just gotten my first job for the Skagit Valley Casino and Resort. Sadly, I didn't have many finances, only enough to cover rent for a room in an old farmhouse just off of Chuckanut. This was lucky for me, as it was only a few miles from the casino, which was just off the Interstate 5 and was a more than feasible ride on the hand-me-down bike I had procured shortly before graduating Job Corps. When I started, I was a dishwasher, and one that worked the swing or night shift. Getting to work was a bit of a pain. The ride was mostly uphill and along the windy Bow Hill Road, but over time it became manageable. I had just moved into the farmhouse and was starting my second week when I had first come to regret taking the night shift. Sadly, at this time, I only had a cheap gas station flashlight to illuminate my ride, which at night was made even darker since Bow Hill Road cut through dense forested areas and had several twists and bends, and it made the whole ride harrowing in some instances. My first ride home at around 3 a.m. hadn't gone well. Within minutes of departure, I had been attacked by an animal which darted out of the underbrush and tried biting at my right leg. I didn't see what precisely lunged out at me, though in hindsight I'm certain it was a coyote or a stray dog. Fortunately, it didn't bite me directly, getting a mouthful of jeans before I managed to kick the beast off and fly down the hillside for home. Needless to say, my first ride in the dark, alone, with barely any light, made me very apprehensive about future night rides. The next few days found me very on edge when riding home, fearful of another animal attack. Since I wasn't familiar at the time with what the typical wildlife of the area was, I was fearful of encountering Washington's larger and more aggressive predators, primarily black bears drawn to the sloughs during low tide and blackberry bushes, and, cougars. Thankfully, those nights were uneventful and overall pleasant, save for one particularly rainy night which made visibility worse. Before I continue, I feel I need to explain one aspect. Heading towards the casino along Bow Hill Road, just off Chuckanut, there's a small cattle farm which raises cows for artisanal cheeses,
which, if you're ever in that area, pick some up. It's amazing. Bow Hill Road at this point twists in a weird way, snaking its way through two oddly placed plots of land, with both sides lined with thick wild brush and a small copse of trees on one side, the other with the fencing and cattle enclosure. As I was riding home, a very pleasant and bright night, a rarity in the typically overcast region I live in, my ride home was going smoothly. I'd estimate it was roughly 2 a.m. when I left work, and that since most of the ride home was just a pleasant coast down the highway, my attention was mainly on the bends in the road, and I was making sure not to drift too close to the uneven and gravelly shoulders. I had just made it down the hill and was making my way along the snaking portion as mentioned, which took me between the cattle farm and abandoned plots, maybe less than a half mile from home. And then I saw something that to this day, I can't say for certain what it was. Just as I was making the first bend, less than 50 feet ahead, I saw a large, dark brown or black furred figure stride across the 2-lane road and down into the ditch that separated the road from the cattle fence. My blood had gone cold. Just in the faint and shitty beam of my cheap flashlight, I could only make out a large torso, seen partially in profile and exposing what I can only assume was its back. I didn't see details such as the head, arms, or legs, only that the figure that moved in front of me looked roughly 8 feet tall and half that wide at what I can only assume were its shoulders. In that instant, I shouted, certain that in the moment my worst fears of a bear attack were going to happen, and that all my instincts were telling me to pedal as hard and as fast as I could. Between the shock of this figure suddenly appearing and moving in front of me and the fear of being mauled, I'm thankful I had the good sense to shout. In case you're not aware, bears, and black bears in particular, are easily spooked, and they tend to flee from humans if you make a loud noise, unless of course there's a mother bear with young nearby. Regardless, I Lance Armstronged it all the way home, grateful for the streetlights on the highway, and I managed to get home, though I ran as if I was being chased once I got off my bike until I was safely in the old farmhouse. I managed to get to my room, locked the door, and then sat on my bed, holding myself and practically hyperventilating from both exertion and fear. Now, I'm sure some of you are going to ask, did you see a Bigfoot or Sasquatch? I don't know. I truly can't say. I can tell you for certain what it wasn't. It wasn't a bear. Bears typically, if they don't stand, walk upright, and certainly not as fast as whatever it is I saw was walking. Additionally, bipedal bears walk very awkwardly, more like a waddle than something striding. It wasn't, as far as I can recall, a vagrant either. While it's true that the area does see some homeless traffic of people making their way north towards Bellingham, most of the time they travel during the day, and almost always with carts, bags, or stuff like that. The chances that what I saw being a very tall homeless man wearing a full fur jacket in August, which even that late at night wasn't cold at all, is highly unlikely. So what was it? I can't say that, but I do believe in the existence of Sasquatch. I've never been able to say definitively what I did see, only that it was large, moved fast, and made me feel very helpless and more anxious for the weeks to come until I managed to transfer to the morning shift. Whatever it was that I saw, I never experienced anything like that again, at least when it came to encountering some unknown, large, furry creature walking down the road at 2 a.m. Was it a bear? Was it Sasquatch? Was it the tallest hobo with the most unusual fashion sense? I have no idea. Even to this day, I still wonder what I saw, and if I was in any real danger. After I had shouted and booked it as fast as I could, the only sound I heard behind me was a sudden rustling of brush and a deep grunt, although in my adrenaline-fueled flight, it's possible those sounds could have been caused by a cow near the fence. But still, none of that explains whatever it was I saw that night.
The Flag, submitted by Justin W. In 1987, my brother and I were adopted by my grandmother as our parents' drug habits spiraled out of control. My grandmother was raising my aunt and uncle that were teenagers still at this time, so this meant a bigger home for all of us. My grandmother worked 2 jobs just to make sure we had what we needed, so she was never home, and basically my aunt and uncle raised us. We found a beautiful 4-bedroom home with an upstairs loft, and to this day was the best home I've ever lived in. While cleaning out the loft, my uncle and I discovered a folded flag, and we thought, wow, this is cool. We decided to make the loft our rock and roll fortress of solitude. We had several Iron Maiden posters, mixed with Guns N' Roses tapestries, and some Kiss stuff thrown in there. It was very heavy metal, I have to admit. When that flag was hung up, that's when things started happening. We could hear someone or something walking up to our loft at night, and it wasn't unusual for my grandmother to come up and check on us a little after 11 each night. But this would be around 1 or 3 a.m. at night. Months went by, and different things happened, and we could hear military music coming from the basement late at night. My aunt recalled seeing what appeared to be a man in a white tucked shirt and slacks heading towards our loft one day after getting out of the shower. It scared her so bad, she was at the neighbors when we got off the bus one day. Lights were turning on and turned off by themselves, as well as stuff was moving around without explanation. It got really bad. My aunt and uncle decided to go to Kentucky to visit family over the summer that year, and my grandmother had vacations saved up at both jobs so she could take a week off with us while they visited. Sunday night of that week was the turning point. We had been sleeping in our grandmother's room as we were scared to sleep by ourselves with all this stuff going on. It was 11:34 at night, and I'll never forget it, because Grandma had a digital clock. While staring at it trying to go to bed, I heard what sounded like a poster being ripped in our loft. My little brother said, "Do you hear that?" My grandmother said to be quiet, and then we heard what sounded like someone destroying our loft. Posters being ripped up, cassettes being smashed, albums being broke, the whole 9 yards. Bless my grandmother's heart, she grabbed a bat and headed up the stairs as the sounds were still going on. To our surprise, nothing was touched. There wasn't one thing out of place. Puzzled, we began walking down when we noticed the shadow of a person standing in the hall. We raced down the hall to see it disappear in front of our eyes. My grandmother asked, "Where did that flag come from?" We told her. She said to take it down immediately and throw it away. After that, everything stopped. No more noises. No more nothing. We moved to Kentucky 2 months after this, and fast forward about 3 years, my grandmother got a call from the previous owners asking if we had seen a flag anywhere in the loft. My grandmother told them the story of what we had experienced, and it just so happens that the previous owner's brother was killed in Vietnam, and that flag was his coffin flag. The Men Outside, submitted by Annie. When I was growing up in the 50s in a little town called Hopkinton, Rhode Island, we had one scare that affected me and my friend Susie. We were best of friends, but in this little town, she lived a ways away from me, so when we were little, we only saw each other at school and on weekends. There wasn't really much to our town, and I lived near a church that I think was later turned into a town hall, or it's now some preservation group. I haven't been back there since the late 60s, and I don't know anyone there at all. When Susie and I did get together, we had a lot of fun playing in the woods and in the creek that ran through town. I haven't thought about this in a long time, but my daughter told me that she listens to your show, and after listening to it, I remembered a scary time back around 1960. Susie and I must have been 9 or 10 when this happened. She was staying with my family one weekend in the summer, and we had been splashing around in the creek looking for salamanders and such. After a while, Susie nudged me and then pointed over to a tent or something on the other side of the water up a little bit. She said we should go over and check it out, and that's what we did. When we got closer to it, we could smell something bad. It's been so many years, but I remember like it was rotting meat or that sort of thing, just stinky, like body odor and sweat. We crept up to the tent wondering where it had come from and who it belonged to, as this didn't seem like anyone we knew from our tiny, tiny town. Older boys camped out all the time doing their Boy Scout things, but we knew most of them, even the older ones. Susie was always braver than me, and she picked up a stick and stuck it into the door flap of the tent and pushed it up a little bit. We saw a boot and jumped back a bit. There was someone in there. That's when we heard a voice behind us say, "You little girls, get away from there!" We nearly fell over scared out of our minds, and turned to see a really scruffy-looking man standing near the woods a little ways away from us. He looked scary then, and he's still scary in my mind. He had a stained white shirt and looked like he hadn't shaved for weeks, but wasn't growing a beard. It was just gross-looking. We both let out a little squeak like frightened girls do, and the man started walking towards us, saying, "Come here." I didn't want to, but we had also been raised to listen to our elders, so we just stood there being scared as he walked towards us. Just then I felt something on my foot, and I looked down and screamed as I saw a hand grabbing at my foot. Another man had come out of the tent, so there was another one in there. I jumped up, and my little shoe and sock came off in his hand, and I don't even remember looking at him as I started running away, telling Susie to come on. We slid down the bank into the creek and splashed ourselves away from the men. I looked back for 1 second and tripped, just like in the spooky movies. I looked up to see the men going down the bank and coming into the creek after us. I got up soaked, looking like a wet cat, and kept running with Susie, who was now way ahead of me. We ran and ran up out of the creek and into the woods that would lead us up to the church that I mentioned. My ankle was hurting me a lot, but we kept going, every once in a while hearing the men yell for us to get back there. Susie and I got to the road and to the church, but the front doors were locked, so we ran around the side. That door was locked too. "Should we just go to your house?" Susie asked, but I told her my ankle was hurt and I needed to sit down. She spied a window to the basement that was open and said we could hide there until we thought the men went away. We slipped in and dropped down to the dirt floor, and then we crawled to the other side of the basement, away from the windows and into the dark. It was dark and cold and wet down there, and it smelled funny like dirt basements do. There were 3 sets of windows on each side of the basement, and it didn't take long before we saw legs and feet moving slowly along them. We held our breath as the 2 men stopped at the open window. And they stood there for a while talking, but we couldn't hear them. And then they finally went away, thank goodness. We waited there in the dark for another half hour before we went over to a staircase that led up, hoping the door would be open. And it did. We stepped into a cleaning closet and then out into the church. A priest named Father James was out there, and he saw us and came walking over. I was still crying. My ankle hurt so much, and we tried to tell him what had happened, but I'm sure we were talking too fast, and we were still too scared to get things out. He said he'd walk us home, and that we were now safe. When we got there, my mother got upset, and we told her what had happened, and she called the doctor for me and tried to get us to stop crying and calm down. She thanked Father James, and he left. The doctor came out and looked me over and said it was just a mild sprain and that I needed to stay off it. I'll always remember that he said I needed to play indoor games for a bit, and my mother saying she'd already made that decision for me. Daddy got home from work later, and my mother told him what had happened, and he got on her phone and told the person on the line that he needed to make an important call, and whoever it was got off right away. It's funny how I remember things like this. Does anybody listening to this remember party lines? Wow, I guess I am really old. Later that night, some of the men in our town came over and sat on the porch talking to my daddy, but my mother shooed Susie and I back inside. We sat in the living room playing with some puzzles and listened to the radio, when Susie got up to go to my room to get something out of her weekend bag. A minute or so later, she screamed, and Mother and Daddy came running in, looking at me, and I just said, "Susie, she went into my room." They went to my room in the back of the house, and Susie was crying and saying that the man was in the window when she went in there. Daddy pushed her over towards my mother, who held her with open arms, and then he ran back to the porch. All I heard was, "That son of a bitch is out here," and the sound of the men getting up and jumping off the porch. Daddy ran back in, got his shotgun with my mother saying, "Dan, wait!" but he was already back outside. The men were gone for a long time that evening, and Susie and I were in bed when they got back. I heard Daddy come in, start whispering to my mother about something, and they whispered back and forth for quite a little bit. And then I fell asleep. The next day, I begged my mother to let me go outside in the backyard and just sit in the sun rather than be inside, and she said okay if I promised not to be up on my ankle. I sat in a lawn chair, and Susie was making me laugh with a dance and song she had just made up to entertain me. Then she stopped and pointed to a box by the side of my house and asked, "What is that?" I said it was Daddy's burning box. We burned a lot of trash in a fire once a week in the warmer months. She went over to it and picked up a dirty shirt that had what I thought was red paint on it at the time, but later figured out what it really was. Susie then picked up something else, just a bit because it was heavy. It was the tent where we had run into the men the day before. I can't say for certain what happened that night, but I have a pretty good idea. I'm not saying that it's right, but I do know that we were protected by my daddy and my friends' daddies. We never said a word to my daddy or mother that we saw those things in the burning box, and we promised each other we'd never tell. Susie lives in California now and I don't see her that much, but I think she'd be okay with me telling you this story. That was a very scary time in my life, and I'm still scared telling it right now. The Old House, submitted by Tester's Choice. I grew up in a suburb of Atlanta. There were a lot of newish neighborhoods that had been built up over the years, but back in the 70s there wasn't as much as there is now. That's life, I guess. So when some developers were going to build one of these new housing developments, they were also going to knock down this old estate that was the so-called haunted house by all the kids in town. We would always sneak out there and scare each other with tales of ghosts and stuff we'd heard from other kids and our siblings. As far as I really know, it was just a huge old run-down house. When we heard that it was going to be torn down, we decided to go out to it one last time before it was gone forever. Of course, we had to go at night for maximum scare effect, right? There were 5 of our gang, me, Joe, Bill, Keith, and Emma, who was Keith's little sister, and quite a tomboy. We got flashlights and headed out, probably telling our parents we were going somewhere else. We knew they didn't want us out there, especially with the demolition coming up soon. It was about a 15-minute walk to get there, and when we did get there, we saw that a lot of the trees that were once around it had already been cut down. Far down a lane was the place, and it was just getting dark. The house was massive. I don't know how many bedrooms and other rooms, but there were at least 6 bedrooms. It was totally unsafe to be out there, but kids are kids no matter where you go. Joe was talking about all this ghost stuff, getting everyone else scared, and Emma was telling Keith that we shouldn't go inside. We were all laughing at her because we knew the stories weren't true. We got up to the house, and Joe and I tried the door. It was locked or jammed, so we couldn't get in that way, and Emma looked happier. But we really wanted to get in, so we moved around to the back of the house, and holy smokes, a huge portion of the back had already fallen down, like someone had just grabbed the whole wall and yanked it outward. It was still light enough for us to see, and we could make out that there was some furniture and stuff still inside. I started to walk over the rubble with the guys right behind me, and Emma still saying we should leave. I really wish we had listened to her. Once we got inside, it was a little darker, so we switched on our lights and began exploring. Bill and Joe decided to head upstairs, and they said that they could feel the steps sagging beneath their weight, but it was holding up. I was checking out a front parlor with Keith and Emma, and that's when we heard the noise. It sounded like a person coughing, but it was coming from down the hall somewhere. I went over to check it out. Maybe there was someone else out there that was doing the same thing we were. But there was no one. I could hear the guys moving around slowly upstairs, so I knew it wasn't them. And then it came again. This time behind us, opposite of where we first heard it. And I looked at Keith, and he said, "What was that?" I shook my head and then yelled out, "Hey, who's there?" No answer. It was weird. I walked down the hall to see if someone else was over there, but nobody was, or so I thought. While I was telling Keith no one was there, a closet door creaked open, and two men in their 20s, I guessed, came shambling out with these weird grins on their faces. It's been decades since this happened, but I'll always remember how they looked. They were creepy and wearing stained clothes and had dirt on their faces and arms and hands. Without saying a word, they walked towards us, and one pointed at Emma, and they both kept grinning creepily. I turned, ran into Keith, who then bumped into Emma, and she fell down. I tried to run and grabbed her by the arm and started pulling her along with me, and she let out a scream, more of pain than fright, I'm guessing. Keith grabbed her other arm, and we got her on her feet, and she screamed again. Now, I can't be sure, but I'm almost positive one of the guys said, "I don't like it when they scream." Keith doesn't remember that to this day, but I'm pretty sure that's what I heard. We ran out of the room and down the hall to the way out, and Keith yelled for the other guys to get out of the house. Someone else was in there. Emma was crying and wailing at this point, and I'm just trying to get her to move faster. Bill shouts back, "What? What's going on?" And I just yelled, "Get out!" I heard thudding upstairs as we scrambled over the rubble and back into the grassy yard, and I looked back to see Bill running after us. We ran to the edge of the trees, and then curiosity got at us as we looked back to see if the men were chasing us. That's when we realized Joe was not with us. "Bill, where's Joe?" I asked. Bill said he thought he was right behind him, but of course he wasn't. Emma was still crying, and I told Keith to take her home and get some help. Bill and I'd go back and look for Joe. He nodded and started running off with his sister right behind him, trying to keep up. Bill and I talked about a plan to go back in the house to get Joe, even though we were scared and didn't know where he was. We scrambled back over the rubble and went inside, and we tiptoed through the rooms until we heard voices talking low and something that sounded like paper being crumbled up. We heard steps coming our way, so we ducked into a front room, and we noticed the two men walking by, talking quietly. Again, we couldn't make out what they were saying. All was quiet again after a bit, except for the crumpling sound. I peeked down the hall to the room where we had seen the men and moved towards it. The sound got louder, and both of us went into the room, and we saw legs sticking out of the closet. It was Joe. His feet and hands were tied, and there was a rag in his mouth, and he was crying, and man, I couldn't blame him. We were all scared. While Keith stayed in the doorway keeping an eye out for the men, I untied Joe, and we heard the voices again. This time they were outside, and when we looked through the dirty windows, we could see the men in the backyard looking at the trees, and I'm sure they were looking for us. We decided that we'd try to open a front window and go out that way and avoid the men, and that's exactly what we did. There was a short drop into some bushes, and we got cut up pretty good, but we started running from home like you wouldn't believe. Halfway there, we slowed down and asked Joe what had happened, and he said when he came down from the upstairs, one of the guys grabbed him, and they tied him up and put him in the closet. They didn't say a thing, and he had no idea what they were planning. When we got back to Keith's house, he had told his mom and dad what had happened, and his dad was on the phone with the police. They went out to the house, but there was no sign of the men other than a bunch of empty cans of food and dirty clothes. The men were nowhere to be found. We all got in trouble for going out there, and I sure got hided by my dad that night. But we all survived and now have a scary story to tell. The house was finally knocked down, the development went up, and we never saw those men